All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the second part of the April 6th, 2018 lecture on authoritarianism for comparative politics 103 at Mesa College. In the first section of the lecture, we took a look at the cases of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and discussed how authoritarian regimes in those places were sometimes able to manipulate independent press and opposition parties in order to deepen their control over the country. And this should be ironic or counterintuitive because these are, of course, hallmarks of democracy, having an independent media, having opposition parties that are available to challenge the dominant party. But we saw that in some amounts, with some restrictions and some manipulations, that in fact the presence of these supposedly democratic institutions creates or provides an opportunity for the autocratic regime to maintain power. In this part of the lecture, we're going to take a look at a second set of supposedly democratic institutions that are also often abused by authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes. In this case, we're going to talk about elections, and we're going to talk about those elections in the context of Egypt. So before we get into the theory of election management by authoritarian regimes, let's talk a little bit about the background of Egypt. This is a photo of Hosni Mubarak. He is on the left, seated next to Anwar Sadat, who was at the time of the photo the president of Egypt. In 1981, Sadat was assassinated by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, a prominent Islamist group at the time. Following the assassination, Mubarak served as president of Egypt until 2011. Mubarak's presidency stood for regular referenda. The people were allowed to vote on whether or not to recall Mubarak and his party and his government. And in those votes, the tallies typically showed greater than 90% support for his administration. In 2005, Mubarak finally stood for first ever multi-party elections in his presidency, and official returns gave him 88.6% of the vote. In all, Egypt's National Democratic Party ruled through Sadat or Mubarak for about 40 years, and if you include the prior incarnation under Gamal, this party was in charge of Egypt for about 70 years. According to Freedom House, the Egyptian political system was designed functionally to keep the NDP in power. The People's Assembly of Egypt had the constitutional authority to check the president's power, but under Mubarak, this body functioned essentially as a rubber stamp. Nearly all legislation passed by the People's Assembly was initiated by the president or his office, and using the People's Assembly, Mubarak maintained an official state of emergency that allowed him to ban demonstrations and jail opponents at will, and Mubarak maintained this state of emergency for more than a dozen years. Despite the clampdown on civil rights and the neutering of the parliament, Mubarak allowed for multi-party democracy, first at the level of the People's Assembly, and then eventually multi-party candidates were allowed to challenge him for the presidency. These candidates included individuals from the WAFD, the National Accord Party, the Democratic Front, and for a time, running as independents, members of the Muslim Brotherhood. This was a group that has been variously banned and allowed to stand for elections in Islamic countries around the world. Opposition strength in the parliament ranged from about 5% to about 20% during Mubarak's presidency. So that means that at any given time in the People's Assembly, about 5 to 20% of the assembly was made up of people outside of Mubarak's party. Of course, we know how this ends, right? This is a picture from Tahrir Square. Mubarak is overthrown in 2016. But there are still some important questions. The NDP, like the PRI in Mexico, like the People's Action Party in Singapore, and like many others, maintained power for a really long time. And during that time, they decided to hold elections. Part of the reason that Blades' book is worth reading, even though Mubarak fell within a year or so of her writing it, is because it lays out an important answer to an interesting puzzle. In what way do these fixed elections for meaningless offices meet the interests of all the participants? Why do authoritarian regimes hold these elections? Why do elites participate in them? And why do people bother to vote? So let's lay Blades' puzzle out a little bit more specifically. What does a dictator risk by holding an election? And there must be some incentive to have an election if we believe that the dictator is risking something by holding the election. We're inviting people out. We're inviting them to vote. People are going to talk about the election. They're going to talk about which candidates they're voting for. There's a potential here that having the election is going to undermine the autocratic regime. So it must provide some benefit to the president for life or dictator in order to hold these elections. Second, why would elites bother contesting this election? They know that their parties are destined to lose. They know that the office for which they're running is a rubber stamp office and a rubber stamp parliament. Why do they bother to run? What do they risk if they win? What do they risk if they lose? What do they gain if they win? Lastly, why would an everyday citizen bother to go stand in line and vote in an election that seems to have no consequence on government policy? What's the point of getting out the vote for an autocratic election? We can look briefly at other reasons for having elections, some of which we've seen before, and we can ask how much they seem to match what we observed in Egypt, or maybe even what we might expect would happen in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, since we know these cases a little bit now. The first alternative theory here relates to the sort of roving bandit theory that Olson laid out in one of our first weeks of class. One of the reasons that you might hold an election in autocracy is that it allows for elites to compete. It allows for multiple people who might have a claim to be president to run through an election, win an election, and that prevents civil violence because we know who dominates it mobilizing voters, and therefore we know who would dominate in a civil conflict. We'll ask ourselves if this model seems to match for Egypt, and ask why or why not. I think from the case that we just saw, the amount that we laid out, we know that this model doesn't really match for Egypt because the winner is never in doubt. No one would beat Mubarak at mobilizing voters. No one can beat Mubarak at fixing these matches. And so no one we might expect, if Olson's right about the world, would beat Mubarak at a civil war. And if this is the case, then we still have a puzzle about why Mubarak would bother to have these elections. Tilley would argue that elections generate accountability between a security state and the groups that fund it. So even though Mubarak continues to be elected, there's something about these elections that are actually holding him accountable. But we know that there doesn't seem to be much accountability here, right? There's no mechanism by which the citizens who are voting are capable of changing policy, and so Tilley's model seems to fail in the case of Egypt as well. A last potential explanation is that autocratic regimes hold elections for the purpose of signaling to donors or NGOs, and these donor states or NGOs require some sort of plausible election in order to provide a state with aid. For example, if the United States were to pass a law that we were not allowed to provide military aid or humanitarian aid to countries that aren't democracies, one reason that you might expect an autocracy to hold an election is to signal internationally. So does this work for Egypt? It's possible that in some ways having these elections provides Mubarak with plausible deniability. He's allowed to say that he's a Democrat because he technically holds elections. But is anybody actually fooled by this? The referenda about his rule earned him 90% support. He earned over 85% support in the one election that he stood for. He fails Chesworski's test. He fails Vanhanen's test. He fails Freedom House's test and Dahl's test for democracy. And so it seems really unlikely that the American or European foreign ministries or state departments are in any way fooled by these sorts of elections. And so Blades argues that none of these models of electoral or explaining elections seems to hold water when it comes to Egypt. And so therefore we need a new theory for what's going on here. Blades, in order to explain these elections, Blades first references a theory that's known as the dictator's dilemma. So we start with the question of what the dictator gets out of having elections. If we were in class, I would ask you guys if you recognized this person. Chances are you won't because you're young. His nickname is Comical Ali. He was the information minister of the Iraqi regime during the Second Gulf War. He's famous for appearing on television, on Western television, to tell networks like CNN and Fox that there was no problem in Iraq, that the Americans were unlikely to win the war. And in one of the last broadcasts in which Comical Ali appeared, you could actually see the American tanks rolling by in the background of the picture as he assured everyone that the Iraqi military was doing fine. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that Comical Ali was giving the same sorts of appraisals of the Iraqi army's performance to Saddam Hussein. Why? People in dictatorships lie. We'll talk about why you might expect the underlings of the dictator to lie to him, why the dictator ends up surrounded by yes men in a little more detail in a few slides. In fact, we can make it a little bit more formal right now. Let's say that you are a dictator. At some point, you will have a rival approach you, and that rival will tell you some story about why you need their help. Right? There's some group of people, probably a group of people in some hinterland part of your country whose language you don't speak, who are threatening to revolt. They're threatening to do something that undermines your security as the leader. And the underling will tell you that they can provide some type of service because they understand the language or the culture or the needs of the people in this particular part of your country, that they will be able to provide you with some sort of service, some way to put down this uprising. Now, of course, they're going to want something in return. They'll want power, they'll want influence, they'll want money. It's going to cost you. You'll have to pay them directly. You'll have to include them in your inner circle and reset this careful balance between all of your allies that you've set up. So now you have to decide what to do. What's the challenge in picking a strategy here if your Skeletor and Merman approaches you and says that the fish people are getting restless? What is the problem or game that you're faced with? Okay, hopefully you were able to recognize that this is an informational asymmetry. Merman has an incentive to tell Skeletor a lie in order to get paid for doing nothing. Now let's take a look really quickly at the idealized payoff. If Merman is telling the truth, and Skeletor pays him, Skeletor gets the revolt handled, and he identifies a new right-hand man. He identifies someone he actually needs in his cabinet, he needs in his inner circle in order to make sure that some important demographic in his country is taken care of. If Merman is lying, and Skeletor pays him without needing to, this in a way erodes his power. It allows Merman to get closer to taking over. It gets in the way of Skeletor's ability to use profits from the demographic that Merman represents to redistribute those to people in his inner circle that are helping prop him up. This plugs directly into what we talked about in the last section of the lecture, where Schatz criticizes Akayev in Kyrgyzstan for failing to make these sorts of payments to people outside of his family, and he praises Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan for being able to raise rents from impoverished groups, to raise money from groups that are unable to challenge his rule, and redistribute those rents to rivals that he actually needs to pay off. And if Skeletor is using some of his resources to pay off Merman, if Merman is able to get in the way of Skeletor taking taxes from the fish people, at some point this starts to erode Skeletor's ability to build a coalition and maintain a coalition among the people who are actually a threat to him. So here, Skeletor faces real possibility that the fish folk plan to revolt, and he's lost the help of the Merman in handling it. In this case, Merman goes home empty-handed and nothing happens. So the problem is that there's no Carfax here to help Skeletor manage this problem. So what might he use? What sorts of institutions might allow him to puzzle through this problem? Well, he has advisors, right? Skeletor can ask Beastman to look into this issue for him, but there's still a handful of problems with this issue, right? First, Beastman doesn't speak fish folk. He probably doesn't understand what's going on underwater. The people who live in Merman's constituency are likely to lie to Beastman because Beastman, they know, is an emissary of Skeletor, and if they're planning some sort of revolt, they're not going to tell him the truth. Second, to the extent that Beastman is already a member of Skeletor's inner circle, to the extent that Beastman is already getting paid out of the rents that come from the fishfolk constituency, and to the extent that he is paid in order to repress these sorts of rebellions, Beastman has an incentive to tell Skeletor that Merman is lying. This preserves Beastman's influence. He doesn't anger Skeletor. And he doesn't give any sort of impression that he's failed. So the dictator's dilemma and Blades argue that this is a real problem for autocrats. Skeletor is not entirely sure who to trust around him at any given time. So now we can return to the question of what a dictator gets out of having elections. Blades actually argues that an election is an elegant solution to the informational asymmetry that Skeletor or the autocrat faces in these circumstances. Okay, so one of the things that a dictator gets out of having elections is information about elites. What does this mean? What sort of information are we talking about? Part of what they gain is that the dictator learns which elites are capable of mobilizing mass support. To some extent, this does actually follow Olson's logic of civil conflict. Notice what we've done. We've made some assumptions about what a dictator wants, survival, and we've created a basic model of one of the challenges they might face to achieve it, an informational problem. From this, we've used a theory of the state, Olson's theory of the state, about why we have democracies, why we have elections, and we've adapted from Olson's theory an expectation of what might vary, what the dictator might do in order to solve the informational problem. So in order to learn about which elites are mobilizing mass support or capable of mobilizing mass support, the dictator creates a new state institution. They create an autocracy that features an election in order to help them manage their informational asymmetry. So what we have here is sort of a second image realist theory. We have dictators who care about survival, and they make a decision to change the institutions in their country at the country level. Some dictatorships will have elections, other dictatorships will not have elections, and that helps us explain the survival of autocratic regimes, because we know that the dictatorships that have elections, if we're to believe Blades as we go forward in this theory, that they're better capable of managing their informational asymmetries. So just keep this in mind sort of as we roll through this theory. Okay, we also get a mechanism for elite capture. This is another way that a dictator might use an election. What does that mean? You can buy off winners. You run an election, you force people that you think might win to run through your party, and those people that win you endow with special privileges. In the case of Egypt, this was the fact that there were no penalties for corruption. Members of the People's Assembly, typically they were businessmen. Their businesses could avail themselves of illegal opportunities. They could engage in illegal practices. They could take bribes from foreign countries, and no one could throw them in jail. As long as you were a People's Assembly member, I should add, if you were ever thrown out of the People's Assembly, if you lost an election, then it was possible for Mubarak and his security forces to reach back in time, see the sort of corrupt practices you'd engaged in, and then throw you in jail. So it's actually, once you're involved in the People's Assembly, it's like a set of golden handcuffs. You have to keep winning. You have to keep delivering the goods. You have to be able to promise to Mubarak that you're capable of delivering this constituency over and over again. In addition to the fact that there are no penalties for corruption, these People's Assembly members were given goodies. They were given special access to the state, and they were allowed to hand those things out to the constituents in order to keep those constituents in line. So Blades doesn't spend a lot of time talking about this particular aspect of her theory in the chapter that I assigned, but notice that there are different risks to reacting to a rising elite. Say that you, as a dictator, notice that there is a new elite rising up within a constituency that's capable of mobilizing mass support. You can buy them off. You can include them in the People's Assembly. You can give them some measure of authority. You can allow them to get away with corruption. You can give them goodies that make them more popular with their constituency. That builds credibility and legitimacy, and that creates a person who's inside the government who's ultimately capable of challenging you if they continue to build this base of power. Your second option is to jail or ignore these people. This generates a grievance. It fuels rebellion. It's possible for these people to go back and foment resistance to your regime. So these are sort of the differences between deciding that Merman needs to be part of your inner circle and deciding that you need to throw Merman in jail. It sort of depends upon whether you think that the fish folk are going to mobilize on Merman's behalf or not. But notice that you can use elections to help solve this problem too. In addition to learning about elites, you can use elections and special referenda to learn about mass preferences. This provides a couple of advantages. One is that you can meet these mass preferences from the federal level and undermine the local elite. If you have a constituency that is unhappy with the way that the government is being run, one way that you might manage their unhappiness is to actually change policy at the federal level and deliver them the policy goods that they want. The second is that it allows you a closer assessment of the elite-client linkage. If the block is strong, if it seems like merman is actually closely connected to the fish folk, it's probably better to appease. It's probably better to include that elite in your inner circle and use these mechanisms that we just discussed of elite capture in order to keep them close. Otherwise, there are strategies, such as the one listed above, to split the elite from the mass and attempt to keep your own direct control over this constituency viable. Again, buying off the masses has some different payoffs, but it doesn't generate the same dilemma. If you buy them off, they're probably happy. You just have a constituency that is in your grasp, although it's costly to maintain their happiness, and it's difficult to make sure that you're getting correct information about whether or not the masses are happy. You're always going to have some sort of merman who has an incentive to lie to you about it. On the other hand, if you repress them, you generate a grievance that might lead to rebellion from below. Okay. Now we can move on to thinking about why elites might participate in elections. One reason that an elite might participate in an election is to signal their power to the autocrat. It lets the autocrat know that they are capable of delivering or withholding supporters, and that this number of supporters might be capable of threatening the autocrat's interest. In addition to this, you might signal to your supporters. Right? You tell your constituents that you are powerful enough to mobilize them, and as a result, you can deliver benefits by tapping into the federal government's apparatus, by having the ear of the president on behalf of this constituency. And these are benefits that this constituency would not be able to receive if they weren't loyal to the particular elite that wins the election or that participates in the election. Finally, you can signal to other elites. You can let other elites know how good you are at mobilizing voters. You can let them know how dangerous it is to confront you. You can let them know that your position in this constituency is solidified, and that rather than challenge you, they should try and join your team somehow. They should demonstrate that they should be cut into the deal that you have with the feds rather than competing. Notice, by the way, that the elite role in dictatorships in this way, that they have to sort of play up to the autocrat, play down to their supporters, and play horizontally to their elites, looks a lot in some ways like the mafioso that we discussed in, I think, the third week of class. All right, so lastly, we might look at the role of mass politics in dictatorships and what role elections play in shaping mass politics. What is it that the masses get out of this relationship? Okay, so one thing that you get is the ability to signal your interest to the dictator. I'm just now seeing that I have the same thing twice in the slides, which is really wonderful. Okay, so the first one, which is reproduced twice, is that you can signal to the autocrat. The Egyptians can tell Mubarak exactly what it is that they want, and they can signal that their displeasure is important enough to be addressed. I believe that the second bullet point that I had laid out for this slide was intended to be a signal to the elites. In addition to signaling all the way up to the autocrat, the people can tell the elites when they're dissatisfied by voting for someone else. They can demand through the course of the election different types of services, and they can find ways to let the elite that represents them know that if they're to continue to have access to the special privileges of being in the People's Assembly, in the case of Egypt, that they need to deliver something better to the people. So in sum, this is one of these charts that you'll probably want to grab from the slides for the exam. You see that there's sort of a web of influence trading that develops between dictators, elites, and masses. Each of these constituencies, each of these groups provides the other with certain types of services that are measured and meted out as the result of having an election. Every party gets some sort of information about elite and popular grievances. It allows elites to compete for state resources and get bought off. And it allows civilians to blow off steam and receive patronage or clientelist services. Okay, so as I close out this section of this week's lecture, ask yourself if you're convinced by Blades' explanation and what the strengths and weaknesses are of her argument. Ask what sorts of influences she might have missed in making her model. And as I close this section of the lecture out, I should note that Blades provides in the rest of her book a lot of evidence that some parts of these mechanisms are actually functioning in Egypt. She spends a lot of time, I think she lived in Egypt for 4 or 5 years. She ran several surveys of several thousand Egyptians each and conducted, I think, on the order of 100 interviews with Egyptian elites. So she has a lot of testimony and a lot of data that tends to show that her model of these elections is right. I didn't assign those chapters for obvious reasons. You probably are already worn out from all of the reading that I assigned for this lecture. Anyway, so ask yourself theoretically if you're convinced by this. Ask yourself how well it fits with Schatz's model and the general idea that autocrats are clever enough to manipulate democratic institutions in order to reify their own rule. All right, I will see you guys, I guess, hopefully, in the third section of the lecture in just a minute.